Oh, hello there. Welcome. Pull up a chair, take a seat next to this warm AI-generated fire. Today we're talking through 5 underrated commander cards as of January 2025. This is a regular series that I am continuing on my channel in order to share awesome secret tech with you guys in order to upgrade your commander decks. Before we get into the video, just like to ask, if you like this video, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more. And if you want to support me and my content, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/productionshd, where you can get all sorts of cool perks such as deck audits, your name in the credits of every long form video, personalized video deck text, and you can even play commander games with me. With that out of the way, let's jump into our first card here, Calculating Lich, which is a 6-mana 5/5 creature zombie wizard with menace. Whenever a creature attacks one of your opponents, that player loses 1 life. Now, I really like this card. Obviously, it's a slam dunk in Ishin decks where the attack trigger is going to be doubled, but if we look at the decks that this card tends to slot into on EDHREC, this is seen in a lot of party decks, which it does have the wizard creature type, and party decks tend to go wide, in addition to zombie tribal decks, because zombies, again, tend to produce a lot of tokens and go pretty wide. I like this even outside of a go wide strategy, because if we assume that on average, if this comes down on turn 5 or turn 6 and the average game goes to about 9 turns for Commander, assuming you're in a sort of average power level 7 pod, then we can assume that this card will probably deal about 10 damage per turn cycle, because if we assume that every player attacks with between 2 and 3 creatures per turn cycle, this thing is going to generate about 10 damage, and if it's going to sit on the battlefield for around 3-ish turns, then we can assume that we will get around 30 damage out of this card. I really also just like the general play pattern of this card, because it does force games to a conclusion and encourages that combat. So people love the Monarch mechanic because it encourages combat. This does the exact same thing by forcing through damage, and it discourages players to attack you because they will not get that free damage on their opponents. Like I said, I include this in my Ishin deck. I think this is excellent in Ishin, but definitely give this a consideration if you are in any sort of go-wide deck with black. Our next card here is in the white color. This is Orim's Chant. For 1 white and an instant, we can kick it for an additional white. Target player can't cast spells this turn. If the spell is kicked, creatures can't attack this turn. Now, I don't know about you, but the vast majority of my commander turns are spent playing spells and attacking with creatures, so this basically reads, for 2 mana, you can skip target opponent's next turn. There are exceptions to this. Obviously, this lets through activated abilities, and if your opponent is running a Simic extra lands deck, this will not stop extra lands from hitting the battlefield, but this is a perfect card to have in your hand if there is an arch enemy at the table doing just egregious degenerate things. I actually saw this in use against a Kaalia player at a power level 8 table to essentially shut down that Kaalia player's turn, and they would have won if that spell was not cast because they had an Ancient Copper Dragon on the battlefield. So I think that this card truly represents an incredibly efficient golden ticket, or I guess you could call it a silver bullet, as it sits in your hand, where you can go, okay, no matter what, if somebody is, threatening to attack me this turn, we can cast this on their upkeep. And don't forget that you can politic with this card, and you can ask your opponents, now they are not obligated to be truthful, but you can say, hey, Kaalia player, how about you not swing my turn this way, and you can actually have a turn, because if you swing at me, I can break your whole turn right now. And so this is also just a great rattlesnake effect to point your opponent's damage elsewhere. And this card gets even better in 1v1 scenarios, because at that point it's basically a 2 mana take an extra turn, which is actually Time Walk, which is banned in Commander. So I think Orim's Chant, while it is a little bit mean, if you're at a higher power pod and you need to shut down all of the degenerate stuff that is happening at the table, definitely cast this on your opponents and you will not be disappointed. Our next card here is actually a double whammy because we have two very similar effects. Our first card here is Island Sanctuary, 2-mana enchantment. If you draw a card during your draw step, instead you may skip that draw. If you do, until your next turn, you can't be attacked except by creatures with a flying and or island walk. And in that same vein of card effect, we have Solitary Confinement, 3-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Solitary Confinement unless you discard a card. Skip your draw step, you have Shroud, and prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. So given that at casual commander tables most games end via combat damage, these are very easy effects to skate into the late game, assuming that you can continue to get card advantage by casting cards from your hand. And so therefore I like these cards more in draw heavy control and Pill Fort style of decks, because you do need to meet the requirement to continue to sort of draw cards given that you are skipping your draw step. And particularly with Solitary Confinement, it's both an upside and a downside that it does have a trigger at the beginning of your upkeep. You sacrifice it unless you discard a card. If you like to put cards into your graveyard, if you're in any sort of Reanimator deck, that's not a bad effect necessarily because it is a free discard outlet, but Solitary Confinement does force you to generate more card advantage if you are not going to be making use of that discard effect. And because these are enchantments, if you're in an Enchantress deck, it will trigger all of your Enchantress synergies. So something like a Sithis Harvest Hands will draw enough cards. These decks typically have enough card draw in them to get around, again, that disadvantage of skipping your draw step, and in Solitary Confinement's case, discarding a card. So really love these cards to get into at least second place, and from there, hopefully you can close out the game. And that takes us to our next card option here, which is Fire Covenant. For 3 mana in Rakdos colors, it is an instant as additional cost to play a Fire Covenant, pay X life. Fire Covenant deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. So I look at this card as, on average, I'm probably going to be paying about 5 to 6 life into this effect, and it will pick off at least 2, maybe 3 creatures. So I sort of look at this as a Curtain's Call with upside, where I can pick off more utility creatures by spreading out the damage even more. So if you have something like a Kalia of the Vast staring you down ready to attack, then you simply pay 2 life into this and you can pick off even more creatures, assuming you have the life to spend on it. I will say this card is not as good against stompy decks. Obviously, creatures with high toughness are going to cost a lot more life to get through, but this can shut down all of these sort of utility creatures and creatures that tend to ramp and build up board states. So if you were to look at tiny creatures like your Elvish Mystics, your Polywog Prodigies, your Fairy Masterminds, your Esper Sentinels, all of these sort of draw engine, ramp engine type of pieces, Fire Covenant is perfect to come in and take them all out for the measly cost of 5 or 6 life. And I would say that this card is probably better in higher power pods where life is treated more as a resource than a clock necessarily. So you are probably going to want to spend at least 5 to get your value. So if you are really reliant on your life total being above a certain threshold, maybe don't look at Fire Covenant, but I would say for most higher power decks, they would be interested in this card, which can take out many, many small creatures at once, including the hated Orcish Bowmasters. Now, our last underrated card for today is possibly the weakest out of the bunch, but I think it is an interesting option anyway. This is Shaper's Sanctuary. For only 1 mana, we get a green enchantment that says whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. Now, I would only really consider this for mono green decks, maybe even Gruul decks, because red also can struggle to draw cards, but really we're only considering this for decks that struggle to meet unconditional card draw at the lower CMCs. Mono green just does not have Sign in Blood to just generically draw 2 cards, and so we need to get a little bit creative on how we can draw cards for only 1 or 2 mana. And I think that this is a decent option in a high threat density strategy. So if you're running something like a Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma, or something like a Ghalta deck that's going to immediately demand an answer from your opponents, I think that this is great because it will at least refund you a card if your stuff is targeted, and that also includes clone effects. If there's a clone deck at the table, this card gets much better because obviously the clone deck is going to try to copy a lot of your big stompy creatures, and this investment is only for 1 mana. I look at it as over the course of a game, I think that this will probably draw you between 2 and 3 cards. The odds of having your stuff targeted throughout the course of a game, assuming that this hits the board on turn 1, is 100%. At some point in the game, your stuff is going to get targeted. If we up that to 2, the odds of having your stuff targeted 2 times in a game drops to what I would estimate to be 60 to 75%. I think that, again, in a big stompy strategy, opponents are going to be forced to use their removal on your big stompy stuff so that they don't die. Okay, so then if we go to the odds of having your stuff targeted 3 times throughout the course of a game, I'd put those odds between around 40 to 50%, something like that. So I think on average for only 1 mana, Shaper Sanctuary will draw you about 2 to 3 cards if it hits the board early. If we draw it late, the only advantage here would be if we have a giant threat on board already and we could just slam this for 1 mana, but this is not going to bail you out of a late game situation if you are really looking to top deck like some big card draw. This is one of those cards though where it only costs 1 mana, and so for such a low investment, I just want to experiment with this card a little bit more and collect more data to see, okay, how many cards per game, or rather per turn cycle, does this actually generate, so that we know going in, okay, if it only draws us 1 throughout the course of the game, then maybe we can sort of leave this to the draft chaff bulk of all Magic cards. But if this is going to draw us between 2 and 3 cards, now I'm interested, and so I think I would like to experiment with this card a little bit more in my mono green decks. But that is where I will wrap up the video. So if you guys like this content, leave a like on the video and subscribe to see more awesome content like this. I have other videos where I discuss underrated commander cards, and if you're interested in that, you can check those out right down here.